Okay, Dad. So in some of our previous conversations, you mentioned that American and Israeli power is largely based on fear. If you go against the United States, then you have to be prepared to face the wrath of economic sanctions or our military might. The same thing for Israel. If you dare stand up against Israel, then they'll threaten to blow you up. However, the war in Ukraine has really exposed the United States in terms of the economic sanctions that we placed against Russia have largely backfired. We mentioned before that actually Russia's economy did better than all the G7 economies in terms of GDP growth. And the U.S. military industrial complex is also being exposed as being very bloated and inefficient. We're seeing that we don't have the ability to produce munitions at the rate Russia can, and all of our wonder weapons are being picked apart by the Russians. And similarly, the war in Gaza is beginning to expose Israel, in large part probably because the United States doesn't look as scary, then Israel doesn't look quite as scary. And what we're seeing here in what's happening in Gaza, it's not like the 1967 Six-Day War where Israel was this very powerful force that really kind of shocked the Arab world. It doesn't seem like Israel is able to defeat Hamas. And in fact, we could say that Hamas has more support than it ever had before. It's become a symbol of resistance in the hearts and minds of many people. And the Israelis are hoping to frame Hamas as this evil terrorist organization, but it seems like the PR campaign, they're losing it. And so instead, the conclusion drawn by millions of people is that Israel's carrying out genocide. So first off, would you say that's a good sort of summary of your position and what you feel about Israel and U.S. power?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. I think for Israel has long pursued a policy of overwhelming force, really disproportionate force in response to any challenge or any attack by its neighbors, and as part of an effort to buttress its image, as invincible, as let's say, to just drive out any thoughts among its opponents of even the possibility that it could be defeated. And I think for a while you could say that was successful. I mean, but I think first of all, the October 7th attack by Hamas, just blew a big hole in that, in that image. It showed Israel to be, unprepared, and Hamas pulled off a devastatingly effective attack, though their forces were far inferior. Now, of course, the Israelis have come back, but they, as you were saying, they haven't really impressed us with their ability to take apart and to destroy Hamas, but rather to kill the people of Gaza. That's not something that strikes fear in the hearts of people. It's something that strikes rage, or that fosters rage in the hearts of people. This is, and actually, and among its allies too. So the potential rivals, no longer fear Israel the way that they used to. The anger that they may have felt towards Israel has been intensified, by the recent course of events, and Israel's allies are finding it harder and harder to support Israel. There often governments have remained committed, both in the Arab world and in the Western world, have continued to support Israel, but their populations are restive, are increasingly angry about that support. So, overall, this policy of fear, of instilling fear in the hearts of their opponents, that worked for a while, but it's failing now. It certainly is. And then we're talking about the United States. The United States is a much more powerful country than Israel. But that's one reason that countries have feared Israel, that they, it had the U.S. as its sponsor. Everybody understood that the U.S. was behind it. But now what has this war done?
So the Ukraine, or we're talking about Gaza
Yeah,
right now?
well, we're talking about, this war in Gaza. Ukraine's, we'll get to that real quickly. But, the U.S. appeared in force, in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. But that Red Sea fleet is looking completely impotent, against a ragtag band of guerrillas.
Yeah, the Houthis, right?
Right. Yeah, and that you have to say is part of the Gaza war, as much as we might pretend that it isn't, but it is. And that's been a blow to U.S. prestige and respect for its power. Now, yes, Ukraine. Especially the sanctions war, because that was, the whole world saw, you could say, the U.S. pull out a gun and aim it at Russia and fire it, and it looked like, oh my God, this is the death of the Russian economy. This is going to, the ruble will be rubble, as Biden famously said. But that did not happen. Through this, we know what the outcome was, but I think that we can't really overestimate the effects that this has had on world opinion and the perceptions of countries around the world, about the relative power of Russia and the United States. Everyone has lived in fear of Russian or American economic sanctions. Iran has, of course, been subjected to very severe sanctions. They survived, but they clearly suffered. Iraq was subjected. There were UN sanctions, but brought about at the behest of the United States, and Iraq paid a very high cost for that. We're talking, millions, at least hundreds of thousands of people starved. And those that survived were just eked out a miserable existence, in severe poverty. Iran did a little better, but they suffered. They suffered. But now it's, the same was attempted against Russia, and I think it was always foolish. I mean, Russia is just such a large country with so rich in natural resources, and it already had good relations with China, which is, the world's manufacturer. Yeah, right. I mean, so it was foolish to think that they could bring Russia to its knees. But clearly they had that belief. I think all of us, including the Russians themselves, were surprised by how well they weathered the attacks. The Russians themselves have learned that they were stronger than they realized, and the whole world sees it.
Right, and it seems like we keep on every other week. It seems like we introduce a new sanctions package, and they never seem to be doing anything.
Yeah, no, it's silly. It's just turned into a kind of a running joke.
Right. So, what scares me, what I think about is that the United States, the establishment, they know that their power is slipping. Right. They have to realize this, and if their power relies on fear, I'm afraid that they'll try to project more power by doing something even more radical. And that's why I feel like there's being these pushes, in Israel and the United States, where they're not weak countries. They both have nuclear weapons,
right?
But people are seeing what happened in the United States and Israel have been defanged somewhat. And to maintain that power, I feel like Israel and the United States has to get rid of that image. They have to get their fangs back.
Right.
And I'm afraid of some type of escalation from the United States or Israel to try to prove to the world, like, hey, we're still top dog. We're in charge. Right. How real of a threat?
Oh, I think that's a very real threat. That's a real danger. We just hope that some sort of sanity will prevail and that they'll step back when they come to the abyss, but we can't be sure. I mean, because they have fully committed themselves to this course and to this policy of you can say this policy of based on fear, this fear-based policy. And it's, there's no signs really that they're going to deviate from that course.
Well, yeah, it seems like the system is built around this power structure of fear. Is that would you say fair to say, how the military-industrial complex and the deep state, the neocons are kind of embedded in both the left and the right? Like, I feel like it's just a machine that keeps on moving forward. And if we lose that power, the state is going to have to try to protect itself by trying to become more feared. And by doing so, they might actually be destroying themselves.
Right. Well, you can say that they already are starting to destroy themselves. I mean, it's been a very destructive policy, but also a very self-destructive policy. It's something that could change. There's no reason why, just looking at it, at the matter rationally, that we couldn't have a future president, a future administration that says, okay, we're going to pursue a different course. Of course, any future administration is going to come up against a lot of resistance because, people with those attitudes are deeply entrenched in the bureaucracies and the deep state. You can just hope. I think you're right. They're already on this escalatory ladder. I mean, they have been escalating ever since the start of the Ukraine war. They've sworn that they wouldn't take things this far. They wouldn't introduce this or that weapon system, and then only months later you see them do it. Either the U.S. or Germany. Olaf Scholz is famous for saying no, never, and then the next week saying okay. They're on an escalatory ladder, and it seems like, and the same thing with sanctions, as you say, there's just one package after another, rather than saying, okay, well, maybe we did the wrong thing. Let's turn around and try something else.
Or isn't the definition of insanity to keep on trying something that doesn't work?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I kind of think about, again, the Cultural Revolution. Of course, it's very, very different in many ways, but the people in charge were really crazy. Mao and his minions, and they did unleash this madness, throughout China. But when it came to the point of actually civil war breaking out, and there was a real risk of that, there was a growing conflict between Lin Biao and Mao, and they came. But Mao recognized that. I think in the end, he had enough sanity. He understood that he couldn't push things too far. Of course, they got rid of Lin Biao, but then he also dampened down, the fires of the Cultural Revolution, cooled things down, and once he gained power, and then.
Do you think there's enough sanity in our government to stop it? Well, one thing that surprises me and scares me is also thinking that throughout the Cold War, there was always open lines of communication between the Soviet Union and Washington,
right?
Moscow and Washington, but that seems to be completely cut off now. We don't have any communication. We don't seem willing to talk. We don't seem willing to negotiate. We just have this idea you have to play by our rules, even though that the landscape has changed and we're not able to dictate the outcomes like we used to.
Right.
And it seems like we aren't able to accept that. So I feel like we're almost in a more dangerous place, because it seems like if we can't communicate with the other side, talk to them, can we get off this escalatory ladder?
Yeah, well, again, it's a matter of will, but we just don't see it.
I feel like there's just two paths that we can go down. One is that we have feel the need to reestablish the fear, strike the fear and let people know that we're number one. And we go nuclear. We go full on this escalatory ladder where we just commit more troops to Ukraine, or we back Israel even further, and go get involved in Iran, and we try to strike first, kind of the Lindsey Graham option, strike them hard. Or to me that seems suicidal, but it seems to be that's kind of the system that we are operating on is in place, is trying to push us down that path. The other path that we can take is to accept that we are now in a multipolar world. We can be a regional power, and we learn how to cooperate with the other great powers around the world, like China and Russia, BRICS, and we don't have to be so adversarial. But it just feels like the U.S. collective deep state mentality doesn't allow for that. The way that system works doesn't seem to be won't allow for that option. Right. I hope I'm wrong. Is there another option, or are these the two paths that we have? Going nuclear or accepting or
well, I don't know that it's going to go nuclear.
Well,
but head off in that direction. Yeah, continue
to a wider war, global, more conflict, more death and destruction.
Right. Well, I think one of the reasons.
Are we going to World War III?
That's well, we may. Okay, but we certainly may. One of the reasons why during the Cold War. We did have open paths of communication or channels of communication with the Soviet Union, and we actually did work out treaties to reduce the chance of nuclear conflict, is that we had a healthy respect for the power of the Soviet Union. It wasn't that we loved them, it wasn't that we didn't consider ourselves to be their ideological adversaries, almost opposites. We were the free world and they were the totalitarians. That's the way we looked at it. And that was to a great extent true. But we had, in spite of these ideological differences, we had this very healthy respect for their power. And that just, made us become realists, just say that, okay, yeah, we can't defeat them. If we provoke them too much, it might be the end of the world. That was well understood. And that doesn't seem to be understood now. That fear was lost, I think during the 1990s when Russia collapsed, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia was just a mess of a country. And it was under, of course, it's really since Putin took power that it's been climbing out of and putting things back together and reestablishing its strength. And but we still, it seems like we drew the conclusion that Russia was not a real adversary. Russia was nothing to fear. Russia's concerns did not need to be taken seriously. Russia presented no threat. And as long as we think that way, I think we're going to continue to behave recklessly. But I think the last 2+ years, ever since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine in 2022, not the first year, but I guess beginning really with the utter defeat of the Ukraine's summer offensive last year. And then recent developments, the fall of Avdiivka, and there is this growing realization, that Russia is strong and becoming stronger, that it's going to win the war, and it explains some of the panic. We've talked about Macron. If you look at Macron by himself, you say, well, he sees what's happening, and he's chosen the escalatory road, right? But you see other leaders saying, we're not going to do this. And it's not clear exactly what the position of the U.S. administration is. They haven't announced any change of course. I don't think we can depend on there's going to be a change of course, but perhaps, just over time, there will be this reality will force them to fear Russia. And that will lead to a policy change.
Yeah, I hope so. It's also scary just to think that, we're in an election year, that this plays into the calculation of whether or not we continue this conflict. And what scares me is to think that if Russia begins to start to roll over the rest of Ukraine and marching on Kiev by the summer, this is something that Biden, I think, we can't really accept, because it's going to look so bad on him that it gives me the fear that we will try to escalate to try to prevent the collapse of Ukraine before the election. Do you think that's a valid concern?
It's a valid concern. It certainly is. I mean, we're living in very dangerous times, and we're approaching.
Is there realism amongst our political elite or our military elite? They have to know that Russia is a real threat, a real adversary. And then I don't even know if we want to go down this path, but we just talk about, it seems like we're very hawkish towards China, which just seems absolutely insane. Mm-hmm. You know, we can't even win these proxy wars, and we're going around the country begging African nations for 155 millimeter artillery shells. Mm-hmm. How are we supposed to go to war against China as well?
Right.
Are they completely like, why are we just trying to project that fear, and we're lashing out, and we're just trying to say we're number one and we can fight all these enemies at the same time? Is that the idea? Because it looks weak, I think, to the rest of the world. It looks crazy to any rational person. Or is it? I don't know.
Well, it's hard to know what's really happening, like in the bowels of the Pentagon. You know, you suspect, you can be certain that at least some people are seeing what's happening and are reporting it. But often the people at the top, they just hear what they want to hear, and there are enough sycophantic, bureaucrats that will tell them, "Oh, don't worry what this person told you. We're going to win. Russia's weak; they're about to collapse." That may very well still be going on. Clearly, clearly, it was those voices, the absurdly optimistic voices that prevail, like before the summer offensive. It seems that the administration fully believed that Ukraine was going to succeed, but maybe the abject failure of that offensive is, you just hope. It means that some of the people at the top are maybe now more likely to listen to some of the realists that must still exist, within the bureaucracy.
Well, what are the forces that are kind of pushing back against this escalatory ladder we're on? Because you think it's pretty fair to say that we have been in a constant state of escalation since 2022, the Ukraine war started.
Right. And by the way, I mean, the fact that we've been escalating, the fact that we've been crossing our own red lines, shows that things have not been going well for us. I mean, if it was as easy as we imagined, we wouldn't need to, now commit F-16s or, talk about sending, ATACMS missiles and so forth.
Or France they're going to send
actual troops, right? You only do that because you realize that Ukraine is in a terrible fix. So, I mean, just the fact of this escalation. But one thing there may be, though, we just hope that there may be one red line that they will not cross, and maybe that's sending troops. And Biden has said again and again, and he said it in his recent State of the Union speech, where you can trust me.
Well,
now, of course,
besides sending troops, what other types of escalation can we do at this point? It seems like we've done everything, right? We've sent every weapon that we think we can send, other than nuclear weapons. And
there's certain long range missiles like the ATACMS with the, I guess, the unitary warheads that talked about, something, but that's something that could strike Moscow, for example. And so we've shown, reluctance to do that. Because, or the Taurus missiles.
Right. Well, that's because Putin said straight up, like, listen, if you have these long range missiles that you wish to strike within Russia, realize that we have them too. We can strike Berlin if you try to strike Moscow.
Right. So, I mean, it's either the long range missiles or troops, boots on the ground. And it may be just like, though we've been extremely reckless, and we've had or we shouldn't say we, the ruling elite has been extremely reckless and has not had, has displayed abysmal ignorance, really, of real Russian capabilities. That at some point, we'll say, oh, but we can't do this. Maybe there's just an awareness of how deeply unpopular that move would be, among the Western European and American publics. Maybe that's something that they just can't do. Like you're saying, even, if there's a real breakthrough, if the Ukrainian defense lines break sometime in the next couple of months, and Russia starts driving rather quickly towards the Dnieper. Yeah, that's going to look bad for Biden. He doesn't want that to happen. They're probably thinking what they do to prevent that, before November. But if it happens, you say, well, all we can do is send troops, and that might be even worse. That may have an even more of a negative impact on Biden's election prospects. And he just may be forced to suffer it. He may just make that choice, because I think in the U.S., you just don't have.
But then he's guaranteed to lose.
Yeah, right? But I mean, he's guaranteed to lose either way. That's the thing. I think he's between a rock and a hard place. And yeah.
Well, do you think he might think that we can go and win this war?
Yeah, he might. Right.
That's what's scary.
Right, because there are obviously people who think that.
It's terrifying that there are just a few people in the world that have the power to destroy the world like this.
Right.
And I feel like we're in such a precarious situation where you have, like we said before, Benjamin Netanyahu is facing corruption charges and was looking at prison time until October 7th happened, and now it's his time to kind of completely to keep this war going and eliminate Hamas and be the strong man. It's existential for him. I feel like it's also existential to some extent for Biden. He's banked this Ukraine war is going to be his legacy, and he's going to lose it.
Right.
And he may feel like, I just can't lose it, and do whatever he can. And then I think it's also existential for NATO itself. NATO has gone all in on this war without actually sending troops, but let's be real, this war is really between NATO and Russia. NATO has been arming Ukraine and preparing Ukraine for this.
Training them, providing them with intelligence, with
right.
ISR.
Everything. We're telling them where to attack, drawing up their plans, strategies, and giving them all the munitions, all the money, all the training, all the equipment. So you can say that NATO is losing this war, and if after this, this NATO may not really even be around in a year. Trump's talking about pulling out of NATO. People are freaking out, I think, and it's existential for NATO too. So you have all these.
Right. I
think, would you say?
Yeah. I think, to be fair, actually, that Trump sometimes he makes noises about, not exactly pulling out of NATO, but the fact is, of course, during his first term, he actually expanded NATO. And the demand that NATO countries, pay their fair share is actually, you could say, something to strengthen NATO. So, I mean, sometimes maybe he makes noises that, he expresses some doubts about the utility of NATO, but he hasn't outright said that he was going to pull out of it. And I don't think he will. But there is that. Even so, there is that fear. I mean, he's just a man that engenders fears in his opponents.
Well, do you feel that this is sort of an existential threat to NATO? That if Russia takes over, wins this war, then NATO will be what will NATO be afterwards? Will we try to keep this conflict some frozen and new Cold War era where we have NATO versus the BRICS?
Right. And in fact, you could say that maybe it's not so much an existential threat to NATO. I mean, it's certainly a blow to NATO, but the NATO leadership, the leaders of NATO member countries could say, well, look, now we understand that we need NATO. Russia took this territory. They almost certainly have plans to continue westward. I think that's ridiculous, but it's much more easier for them to say that and make that claim now. And they say, okay, and we some weaknesses were exposed, so now we have to double down and build up NATO again. I mean, that could happen. I don't think it necessarily means that NATO is gone. It could mean that NATO becomes stronger.
Well, do you know what support is like for NATO in Europe? Or do most people? Because it seems like the militaries in Europe are relatively weak. They're having a problem with recruitments and but do they want NATO? Is it popular?
I don't think it really is. I mean, the thing is, this is the funny thing. There's all this constant bluster, about the existential struggle that NATO is in, or all this talk, this loud talk, this really alarming talk. But when you look at, actual budgets, for example. You would think that if, in fact, if they were facing, an existential threat and they thought that the Russian army would be marching westward, that they would be, greatly increasing their defense budgets, introducing, widespread conscription and so forth. And none of that's happening. In fact, let's see what I think I mentioned earlier that recently there was a chance to increase the defense budget in the UK, and they didn't, not by a pound. And then recently, the news came out. It was in Germany was something like 15 billion euros short of what they committed to spend towards NATO. And you say, well, what's going on? I mean, it's just there's all this loud talk, all this bluster, but there is no real effort to change things. Sometimes there's talk about, of actually putting the European economies on a war footing, and which is quite extreme. Even Russia has increased its defense budget from something like 3% to 6%. So it's a considerable increase, but they're not, you can't say they have a war economy, anything like that. And if you go to Russia, you'll see that that's true. I mean, but so that, it seems to be all talk. It seems to be all posturing. Either these leaders just, don't have any real plans, to wage war against Russia. And it's for whatever reason, they see it to their short-term advantage to talk up the Russian threat. Or they're just completely deluded, and there are people who just don't really understand what wars are about, what they entail.
Well, maybe the delusion and competence could be a good thing that won't lead us to nuclear or full-blown World War III.
Yeah, because you can say, attitudes and, commitments and all this, that's one thing. And then there are real-world constraints. You can say, okay, yeah, let's fight the Russians. And then you turn to the generals and they say, we don't have the shells. We don't have the air defense interceptors.
Right.
What are you talking about?
Or support amongst the people.
Yeah,
That's a big thing. I mean, I think Putin was saying that it sounds kind of cheesy, but he said something like the superpower of Russia is their unity, because it seems like that they are very unified here, and there's a lot of support, and they feel like they're in the right. In the Western world, there's a lot of division, and I think it's very difficult to go to a wartime economy. Even if you spent the money, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be efficient and effective at producing these things if the people aren't fully behind it.
Right. Well, I think it's foolish. It's a foolish mistake that the West, the U.S. in particular, has made again and again, is that it's engaged in these wars that are not existential from its own point of view, but are existential to the other side. Mm. And you say, you can, even if you're the stronger party, you're still going to lose that war, because, say, an example is Vietnam. We were by far the stronger party, clearly, by far. But for the Vietnamese that were fighting against us, it was existential, and they were willing to take much more severe losses. I think it was Ho Chi Minh. It said something like, 10 of my soldiers gets killed for every one of yours, but even with those odds, we're going to win. And he proved to be right. And now in this war with Russia, it's actually nothing like that. Russia is not suffering anywhere near as much as Vietnam, but it is increasingly the Russian people are seeing this as an existential struggle. They see how the West is united and against them, and is involved, implicit in all these attacks on.
It's unified Russia.
Yeah, on even pre-1991 Russian territory, and so this is a war that we can't win. I mean, even if we were by far this. Or, the superior military force, we couldn't win it. But it's not clear at all that we're the superior military force. Mm-hmm. This is a war that we're bound to lose.
Right. It's such a crazy time we're in that we have these two theaters. We've been talking a lot about the Ukraine one, but which one is more likely to escalate, in your opinion? Do you think that what's happening with Israel and Gaza and the Arab nations is potentially more explosive than Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, well, it's hard to say, but yeah, I guess there's certain factors. I think like
Because it's existential for Israel. We can say
right,
this. They know that their nation is at risk and they have nuclear weapons.
right,
What will they use them to protect, to preserve their state? You know, because we're looking at, in our last podcast, we talked about how much trouble Israel is in.
right,
Israel realizes they're in that much trouble.
right. No, it is. They really do. You can't quite say that they have their backs against the wall, but potentially, but they may soon find themselves in that position, especially if they take on Hezbollah, if they're foolish enough to do that, and they may very well be. They may feel like they have to, just risk all, the way Netanyahu, looking at his own political career, and his own personal freedom that's just part of it. But just, if we're going to maintain that fear, if we're like, I don't think we can even talk about maintaining the fear anymore. I think that's gone. If we're going to reestablish fear among our neighbors, we're going to have to just deal heavy blow.
Yeah, that's what scares me, right? Like you're saying, Israel and the U.S. have been defanged to some extent, and like you said, we need to reestablish that fear, and to reestablish that fear means taking the path of escalation, right?
Right.
So that's where I feel like we might be going, and is there enough forces of sanity and realism to pull it back?
Yeah, I think like in the case, another reason to worry more about Israel and Gaza is the real support for Israel that exists in this country. I think there are, of course, there's a small but very influential, Jewish Zionist community, very influential.
There's more. Would you say there's more support in the United States for the war in Israel than there is for the war in Ukraine?
Oh,
Ukraine war seems very unpopular.
Yeah, I think like the support for Ukraine in this country is just an inch deep. It's just people wave the Ukraine flag, when the war broke out in 2022, but there are not many Ukrainians here, and people don't really have a connection to Ukraine, but there are a lot of very influential people that have an emotional connection with Israel. And I think that could really make the difference. I mean, again, you have Jewish Zionists, but you also have Christian Zionists, what we talked about last time. And that, emotional commitment to Israel is very, very real, among many millions and millions of Americans. And you find that the Republican Party, including, Donald Trump, has decided to make it a campaign issue. Apparently Genocide Joe isn't going far enough in his support for Israel, because he's occasionally made criticisms of Netanyahu and so forth. Of course, it's nonsense. He wrote a blank check to Israel, and he's given them everything they want. But the Republicans, incredibly enough, are saying that if you believe in Israel, you should vote for us. The Democrats are soft. They're if you vote for, I think recently I saw, maybe it was a Republican congressman said that if you're Jewish and you vote Democratic, then you're just a self-hating Jew. Because
it's like Biden's, you don't vote for me, you ain't black kind of thing.
Yeah, well, the silly. Yeah, so identity politics get mixed up in this, and that can be a really potent mixture. And that's one thing that we don't have, at least, it's not very significant. Again, they're very widespread in the U.S. as far as Ukraine. We do have some people that I think have a real hatred for Russia, and they are people like Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken, but their numbers are small, but they occupy or occupied, in the case of Victoria Nuland, influential positions, but they just don't have that base of support. They don't really have a base in this country. And so when push comes to shove, it becomes a choice of, supporting Israel in its genocide or supporting Ukraine with boots on the ground. It may be that they just the administration, though they do want to, maybe they really want to, but there's too many advisors saying this ain't going to work. This is very unpopular.
Right.
Yeah, maybe just double down on Israel. That's what you should do, and you just stop talking about Ukraine.
Right. So that sounds scary if we think about no matter who gets elected next year, support for Israel is, if Trump gets elected, he's saying that he's going to be more pro-Israeli. Is that fair to say? Is that
that's the position that he's
So it would maybe make Netanyahu even more brazen and do something like attack Hezbollah, go into Lebanon.
Yeah, possibly. It might not really make any difference because Netanyahu may just assume that whatever.
How do we get off? How does I can see the off ramps for the Russia-Ukraine war more. I can see that Russia's clearly winning. Russia is allied with China and the BRICS countries. Also, there are candidates like RFK and Trump that seem to want to push for a negotiated peace settlement, and just like you're saying that the support in this country is not very strong for Ukraine. There's more support for Israel. So how do we get off this escalatory ramp in the Middle East? I can see the off ramp a bit more easily in Ukraine. I don't see much of an off ramp.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, again, it's just that it's because the levels of commitment again are just so high. I mean, it's just that the passion for Israel is just so intense and real in this country among many. Whether you look at it quantitatively or qualitatively, the people with power who are very strongly committed to Israel, like Saban, the number one donor for the Democratic Party. I have one issue, and it's Israel. But then we have millions and millions of Christian Zionists who have, are waving Israeli flags, and they've long had that long support. It's not just a momentary thing. It's something that has become very strangely, and I think, without any rational basis, but it's become an article of faith for them. It's the sort of thing where people are willing to take real risks and make economic sacrifices, and that makes the situation much more dangerous. I don't think people really want to make an economic sacrifice for Ukraine. The number of people that are willing to do that would be minuscule, but it's different when it comes to Israel. And then but it's just that the passions are extreme on the other side. I mean, it's just that, which I can understand. We were witnessing a genocide.
Right.
So when, Biden goes to give a speech, there's always somebody chanting "Genocide Joe" in the background, and he's hearing it.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, I would say, so do you see an off ramp? I mean, what's the game plan that Israel will wipe out Gaza, either try to either eradicate the whole population or get them to move into Egypt or something like this? But Egypt isn't going to open the border. Right. So if they all starve to death, do they think that the world is just going to be like, okay, well, it happened, but now I guess Gaza is Israel now, and we'll just forget about it?
I don't know. I mean, that's the thing, is that you just don't see anything good. I don't see an off-ramp. That's the scary thing about it. I mean, in the case of Ukraine, it's a very, very, very dangerous situation. It could explode and turn into World War III.
But you can see the off ramps.
Yeah, you can see where it's just
we have them. We can take them at any time. These off ramps.
Okay, we're just gonna.
But is there? I feel like
I don't see the off ramps.
That's what I feel too. I don't see how we can go back. I mean, Israel is committed. It seems like to eradicating the Palestinians,
right?
And it's crazy to even say that they're so brazen about it,
right?
And if they've gone this far, I don't feel like they can just be like, "Oops, sorry, we got a little
carried away,
a little."
Yeah, it was just a half a genocide,
right. And now maybe we can all get along. I don't think we can.
Yeah, that's the thing, is when you have too much blood on your hands, it actually becomes very hard to stop the killing. I mean, it's just like we've made these people out to be monsters. Now we can't just pretend that they're not, because if they're not monsters, well, we just kill these tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of innocent people and starve them, and that's something that we cannot admit to ourselves or to anybody else. And that's where you find Israel and this Israel supporters in the West.
Right.
It's a very, very dangerous situation. I just don't see the way out.
Well, then to me, that makes it seem clear that what's happening in the Middle East is definitely the more volatile situation that could really go in a very bad way, that could lead to, how do you think it would escalate? Where would it go? Like, are people, we're kind of in, we're in this weird kind of stasis now, where we're just kind of accepting what's happening and the world's watching.
Right. And the only one group, well, you can say, certainly the Houthis are doing something about it. And I have to say my hat's off to the Houthis. I mean, you say that they're behaving in a very immoral way. Their brothers are being killed and they're standing by them. Most of the great majority of Arab governments are really corrupt and self-interested. They've been forced to criticize Israel, even criticize them harshly, and to put aside any plans they had for reconciliation with Israel, because they know how unpopular such a move would be with their populations. These governments like the government of Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Egypt or whatever, it's hard to see them actually risking war. I guess one thing that could happen is that if it just goes too far, they may be faced with coups or revolutions in their countries, and a new government would take over that is willing to engage Israel in war. That's one possibility. If the other thing is, of course, if Israel does attack Hezbollah, then it could, they may find themselves having bit off more than they can chew. And
I feel like that's what kind of the world is waiting for, is who's going to kind of strike first, who's going to. So because Israel's usually the policy is to have a response to something. They push people to the edge and get people to respond, and then they can justify.
Right. Well, I think they're probably hoping that Hezbollah will do something. So they can in response to a lot of the attacks on civilians and political leaders in Lebanon.
And do you think that's part of their policy, why they're being so vicious in Gaza, is to hope that there will be some type of strike from one of these Arab nations that will give them the justification?
I don't think so. I think they just want to destroy Gaza. I mean, that's it.
If they
and they just don't give a damn about how other countries are going to react. I mean, that's the.
Well, you in our last podcast you said that a million people were looking at starvation,
and it was very high extreme risk of starvation.
And this is a number given by what organization?
I think it's by a UN organization. I can't.
So it's legitimate,
right?
You see it. You see it if you look at it online. You see these videos. And people they're not getting food. They're being stopped from crossing into Gaza. So what happens if a million people starve? A million people die, and it
seems like at some point that something's going to break.
Right.
I mean, it's like all these.
How can everybody sit by and watch that?
Exactly. I mean, you do have these corrupt Arab regimes they're very unhappy with what's going on, but they're just kind of too comfortable, with the current arrangements. They're the deals that they have with the U.S. and the West to really endanger those, or to risk war with Israel. And then you have, the U.S. administration and the Western European governments that are just, again, their way of thinking is just too deeply, the support for Zionism there is so too deeply entrenched. But I think all of it's being put under a lot of strain, much more strain than it's been under for, probably since the 6-Day War. And still, And so you're seeing things like this extraordinary speech that Schumer gave, where he openly denounced Netanyahu. Like he's like been the number one Zionist, one of the most important Zionists in the U.S. government for
He said
many
Israel
years.
cannot survive if it becomes a pariah state.
Right.
And it's becoming a pariah state.
Yeah, but so for his solution is to say, well, Netanyahu has to go, and the problem is, of course, that he isn't the problem. I mean, it's not that
it's Israeli
because of
society.
Right, exactly. If anything, that is, well, I mean, this is what the opinion polls show, that support for the majority of Israeli citizens feel like Netanyahu isn't doing enough. He hasn't been savage enough, we can say, in Israel.
It's crazy.
So if Netanyahu goes, there's no reason to think that we're going to get anybody that's somehow a little more reasonable and may make a deal or,
right, like we said, you can't just say oops and pull back at this point.
Right, there really is no opposition in Israel to this war. I mean, if there was, then you could talk about the possibility, but it's minuscule at this point. There's no real opposition. But just the fact that he gave that speech shows that there are strains. We just don't know. Could there be something that breaks? That finally, that the political elites actually reassess their support for Zionism, and it would be unthinkable, before October 7th or before just the last couple of months. Even now, it seems highly unlikely, but it's not completely unthinkable because. I mean, the horror of what's going on is just cannot be denied. It's actually obviously gotten through to people like Schumer,
Right.
At one level. He's not still really acknowledging, the whole horror of it. Actually, he still supports, I don't know what he's thinking, but he knows something's wrong.
Yeah. Wow. God, it's scary. So it doesn't sound like there's an off-ramp. So are we destined for this to explode?
Yeah, I think it is.
And when it explodes,
I just don't. You just never know how it's going to explode, but it's scary because again,
because can you quickly talk about doesn't Israel have something called the Samsonite? Samson, all right, Samsonite something. They make good luggage,
right?
Yeah, sorry, the
Samson option, right? Right. Israel is believed to have, I think, anywhere from 50 to 200 nuclear warheads. And I think they deny it, and yet they don't deny it. In fact, everybody knows that they have them.
That's their biggest fear stick. Those nuclear
everybody
weapons.
knows that they have it. And they've also let it be known, or at least it's believed, that if the existence of Israel should actually come under real threat, like if Arab armies are marching towards Tel Aviv or something, that they might exercise what's called the Samson option. And of course, Samson is an Old Testament character, a man of enormous strength, who what he did is he pushed apart the pillars in the temple, and the whole temple came crashing down. So it killed him, but it killed everybody, in the temple. And that's the idea. It's like, boy, if we're going to go, everybody or a lot of other countries are going to go with us. There will be missiles heading towards, I heard this decades ago, I don't know if this is still true, but towards Moscow and, to other capitals.
Where'd you hear that from? Is that just...
I can't even remember. We're talking about, it's 30 years ago, so I don't, but it's been well known. I mean, it's something that you hear about again and again. I don't know what the specific threats. Nobody really knows exactly where these, what the Samson. Nobody outside of the, certain people in the Israeli government really knows exactly which capitals are targeted. But they've let it be known that, you may not be safe. We'll just say, if you let us go under.
So they're not even talking about blowing up, Arab countries or Iran. They're talking about just taking out, places like Moscow, European cities, really?
Right, yeah. Who knows? They may have adjusted their plans over the years. Who knows exactly what it is right now? But it's certainly, there's going to be a question mark in everybody's mind.
So the idea is that, we'll hold the world hostage if we have to.
Right.
Well, that's scary.
Yeah.
That's, okay. Well, I think we can end it here.
Okay.
I really hope we can find an off ramp. Maybe we, if you think of one, let it know, and maybe we can call up people in the White House or like, hey, we got it. We got the solution. But right now, I agree. I do not see an off ramp.
Unfortunately, I think that, if there was an off ramp, it would have, there was a chance for an off ramp maybe at the very start, like right after October 7th, if Biden hadn't gone there and written that blank check. Right. If he said, okay, look, I know you're really mad, but we can't support you, if you're going to we've got to pursue diplomacy. It's the same thing, after 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. And just make it really clear from the beginning and perhaps,
right.
A different course. But now we're on this course, this kind of like a train that's, without brakes. And I just don't see how it can end well.
Right. We seem incapable of diplomacy.
Right.
Both with Russia and with our so-called ally Israel. We can't get them to engage in actually just talking. Seems like we're just on this path of violence.
Yeah.
Okay, well, oh boy. Okay, well, let's hope the world doesn't explode, but
let's hope so.
It doesn't look good. Okay, all right, thanks, Dad.